Course Cryptozoology podcast. Today we're talking with Robby Anttila. Robby runs a YouTube channel called Swamp Dweller Reads, where he recounts interesting encounters from around the world that have popped up on the internet. More recently, he's been involved in a few YouTube documentaries as well as one he's currently producing that involves a few fellow researchers such as Scott Martis. With all of the more somewhat fringe subjects that Robby gets into, it should be a very interesting discussion.
Well, I guess I'll just start off with the basics. My name's Robby. I run a YouTube channel by the name of Swamp Dweller. Been doing this about 4 years now. I started as a podcast, interviewing people such as Scott and a bunch of other people we'll probably talk about later. And that kind of grew into more of a viewer submission show where people sent in their, allegedly true experiences and such like that. And that kind of grew into eventually me also covering, unsolved mysteries and doing documentaries on things like cryptids and folklore and, true crime and just stuff like that. It's very eclectic channel overall, very diverse. And pretty much anything that you could, put under the umbrella of kind of like a creepy or a strange, anomalous topic, I'd probably cover it. And for the most part, that's all there is to know about me. I'm just a guy who likes weird things and has an interest in it. I'm a jack of all trades, a master of none. I don't claim to be a cryptozoologist. I don't claim to be a professional in anything other than just being a dude just out here trying to see what's going on,
And that's really interesting because I feel like a lot of people that you talk to in this field kind of like this field in particular. But you mentioned that for you, cryptozoology is interesting because it falls under the umbrella of an unsolved mystery sort of thing. What got you into that particular interest?
Honestly, cryptozoology itself and cryptids and, the monsters that go bump in the dark have kind of been like a fascination since I was a child. I grew up in the rural South, so a lot of time in the Everglades and the swamps of Florida, and a lot of time up in middle of nowhere Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina, a little bit everywhere. And I heard stories from all over, a lot of stories like Bigfoot and all these monsters that are out there. And one that my grandma used to tell me all the time was the Gator Man down here when she lived in the Everglades area. The gator that would take away the bad boys, stuff like that. It's obviously a tale to scare the kids, but that was kind of where it began for me. And when I was around probably the age of 9 or 12, between that age range, I used to go up with my stepmother all the time up to New England, the Connecticut area, and visit her family and all that. And I had a friend up there who lived on the outskirts of that town. I believe the town is called Farmington. And like his backyard went up into like this set of woods. We decided we wanted to build a fort one day, and this was a pretty pathetic fort. It was like string and like some sticks on the string, and for whatever reason we had, on Animal Planet or something, we had seen that you pee around your territory. It's what predators do. For whatever reason, we were like, yeah, we'll pee around this fort. That's a good idea. And, things will, stay away, unknowingly attracting things. All kinds of things came and checked us out that day. But the one notable thing was, I remember my friend goes quiet, and I'm still talking, but he's not replying to me. So I kind of look over at him, and he's just like stone still looking over at this tree. And I look over at this tree, too. And I see what I can only describe after many years of thinking about it and watching a few movies as the werewolf from Harry Potter.
Wow.
Like this Dr. Lupin thing, this very gray, white-looking thing standing there with a hand on this tree, standing up and kind of peeking out at us. And we absolutely ran as fast as we could down this hill. I lost my shoe on the way, so I had to brave it and go back up. And by the time I went back up, I don't believe I saw anything, but luckily, obviously I lived to see another day. There's a lot of things that people have said it could be. People like it could be koi dogs, it could be a mangy bear, it could be this or that. I've seen all these things, and nothing has ever really explain that to me, and that's ultimately, I think, where, the interest in, cryptids really came from. And, I believe that things like this could exist out there, but I'm not necessarily one of those people that are like, I'm not head over heels. I'll always be a skeptic. I'm one of those people that can be slapped by a demon, and I'll be like, I don't know, man. I don't know. But, I
Right.
am willing to say that, yeah, there's some unexplained stuff out there. I can't give a label to it because, how do you give a label to something that you know nothing about?
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty much where the interest for cryptids came from.
Yeah, I can imagine that would propel you into that sort of inquiry. You mentioned that there's no real label that you feel you're comfortable with putting on it because there's just nothing to go off of. Is there anything that's ever been maybe hypothetically suggested by other witnesses that might closely fit the bill, or do you think it's still pretty ambiguous what you saw?
Ultimately, I think it's ambiguous just because I only saw it vaguely for a very short amount of time. So ultimately, it could be a mangy koi dog of some sort, or it could be some mangy wolf. It could be something like that. Who knows? I'm willing to concede to that. But the one thing a lot of people have said, aside from the Rougarou or werewolves and stuff like that, is Dogman, and that's kind of what led me into the initial creation of my entire channel anyway, was the whole Dogman phenomenon. And kind of interesting things there. I've had a few, interesting stories with what you could call a Dogman in the local area, and that's kind of what inspired me to start that podcast I mentioned earlier before it turned into what it is now. So it's kind of just I just really love those local lores and folklores. It's just you hear a story and so many people, share the same story, but it's just slightly different each time you hear it. And I believe everything is based off of facts. There's always a grain of truth in these folklore stories.
You've mentioned that you're really into these kind of smaller scale stories that maybe only exist within a few communities. I should say, that kind of connects, I feel like, to the things you're working on right now at places like Lake Monroe, where you're looking into these sort of lesser known Florida lake monsters.
Yeah, I really love finding something that many people might not know about, if any, and just archiving it and giving it a voice on the internet, and just kind of bringing its attention to people who would have never known about it otherwise. And I just think that's a service that I want to be a part of, and I ultimately like to call myself an archivist because I feel like that's ultimately what I'm doing, in a sense, is just kind of archiving a story and trying to retell it and be as accurate as I guess you could say historically accurate as well as I can be without embellishing it. Something that I kind of got tired of personally when I was watching YouTube videos and documentaries is just how insane people go over the top of, whether it's the editing or the embellishment or just trying to make something seem more than it is, And I was always just I want there to be a place where you can find a more genuine source of, archived information that's not going to be somebody trying to freak you out for the clickbait or anything.
At what point after the sighting that you had did you decide that that was the direction you wanted to take your involvement in this matter?
I would say honestly, really early on, even before all this got successful, before anything that comes with all that happened, I kind of quit the podcast for a minute before I turned it into the Swamp Dweller channel, because I was kind of, how many times can you ask somebody, what do you think Bigfoot is? You know what I mean? It's kind of an interchangeable question, and it kind of gets very boring, and it's just how many times can I say this or this? Everybody and their grandma is a Bigfoot expert. Everybody and their grandfather has a book on Bigfoot, but none of these people have ever seen one. There's no real study of it. Cryptozoology is not a real study, if we're going to be honest. Zoology is a thing, and that's what I like to try to stick to, is the more of the actual scientific aspect of it rather than the commercial aspect of it. Right. And when I witnessed the commercial aspect of it early on, I was very turned off by that, and wanted to kind of, not only use the platform that I was creating to, I guess, combat that in a sense, but also just be able to just have a place where people can come and know they're going to find like accurate information and not just be something to sell a book.
What parts of cryptozoology do you think are the ones that kind of speak to the world in a scientific way rather than a more commercial or contrived way?
I would say that's a hard question, I guess, because I feel like cryptozoology is a very muddy topic right now. Like, it goes so wild because there's even like paracryptozoology where people are studying the ghost of cryptids. So it's like it gets so crazy sometimes. But to me, it's more. I feel like the most beneficial and scientific aspect to cryptozoology is the simple aspect of actually boots on the ground, going out and studying these alleged sightings. Somebody like me can't really take credit for anything like that because simply all I'm doing is relaying information that other people have collected and have studied themselves.
Right.
So simply I'm just the guy that relays the message. But the people that are actually putting work in there, whether it be out there in the woods studying these things, finding footprints or trying to uncover evidence or whatever it may be, those are the people that I believe, or those are the things that I believe are scientifically helpful. Because, I mean, again, like, there's great stories. My favorite cryptozoology story is that of Pongo, the gorillas over in Africa, but like a little over 100 years ago when they were discovered. So these were supposed to be man-eating beasts who would steal people and, sexually assault them and do all these crazy things, and they turned out just to be gorillas.
Right.
And I think that's absolutely beautiful, and I think these cryptozoology and folklore, kind of go hand in hand. They kind of intertwine, and I believe they're with all the entertainment out there like YouTube and all that, it makes it very hard for people to see past the veil of what is the folklore and what is the fact.
Right, and in that way, do you think that there's also, maybe more loosely, but that there is maybe sometimes a connection between folklore and zoology?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, when it came to all those crazy stories about like krakens and stuff, and then we found the colossal squid and all that, stuff like that. Like I believe like it does have a place, but I believe it finding where do you draw the line? I guess how far are we gonna take the folklore aspect as fact and vice versa.
You mentioned in relation to that connection that there's something beautiful about, for instance, the discovery of the gorilla after hearing all these mythologies talking about them as these man-eaters and these sexual predators. What do you think is beautiful about that kind of discovery?
Because I think it shows that most of these monsters are created by man. I think that it shows that ultimately the reason why man is the way it is and where it's at is simply because of fear. And we are very, as much as we are arrogant, strong, smart, cocky creatures, we are very scared creatures. And survival is, the name of the game at the end of the day. So I think it's absolutely beautiful when these monsters turn out to be not really monsters, maybe even some sort of distant cousin in a sense. And to me, I think it's very indicative of the story of early man, where you have many separate different species, if you will, of humans that were all kind of killing each other off in senses to be the only one. And here we are today,
Right.
And so I think it's beautiful in a sense that the animal kingdom's not as much like that as the human world is. So I think it's very beautiful. And gorillas are just, personally, I've done a few really cool things at some parks locally that have like really cool gorilla exhibits where you can actually like meet them and like interact with them, and I just think they're absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, they are really amazing creatures. Is the view of this kind of mythology to some extent being fear oriented, and therefore the worldview of a person being somewhat fear oriented, is that partially what made you branch off a bit from cryptozoology into some other areas? You mentioned like true crime is one thing that you like a lot too. Is that something that was related to your worldview on people, or is it something that's kind of branched off from a different area?
Um, that's a good question. That's another hard one to answer because I'm not exactly sure where like my interest in all these other things came from. Like I guess like my interest in like the supernatural is kind of the same, can come from the same roots as cryptozoology. I've had a lot of I lived in a cabin that was built in 1802 as a kid.
Wow.
A lot of creepy stuff. It was built by Civil War, some people from the Civil War and all that, and their bodies were actually buried in the backyard. I actually found the graves at one point. We'd see all kinds of weird stuff at that house. A lot of weird experiences there. And like I said earlier, even after all that, I'm still kind of a skeptic overall. But I just I feel like the true crime thing kind of comes from more of a morality standpoint and empathy and just being from I don't really have much of a family life myself personally. I don't have a big family. I don't really have a close family. Didn't really grow up in any kind of family like that. So when I see a lot of these cases, especially ones from the 80s and 90s, pretty much any time before DNA was really heavily used, and there's just so many families, kids and mothers and et cetera, all out there with no explanation. And if I can do something that could potentially help further a case, that would be only my right as a human being. So, or not my right, I guess my job or my duty as a human being with a platform with people view me on a daily basis. I might as well do something that is helpful and will bring some sort of closure to the community. There's actually a case, Margaret Peggy Beck. I might still be the only person on YouTube, maybe even the internet, that's ever made a little documentary feature about that. And her case recently became the oldest case solved with DNA.
Wow, really?
So that's very awesome. So, like bringing awareness and putting eyes on things that, even though they've been forgotten, quote unquote, really, really helps. And I've gotten to talk to a lot of these, victims' families and stuff like that. It just it really does help, and it really is appreciated by them. So that's a big reason why I got into that. But it does kind of stem from what we were talking about earlier as well. It's just, it all kind of, ultimately, everything on the channel kind of comes back to that original, I want to put out something that, people can trust and enjoy, and not necessarily have to be some sort of contrived, overly adapted creature feature to, draw in a few cheap views.
With that goal being the goal that you had in mind for your program that you're doing, when you started off by doing it as a podcast, what was the idea with interviewing people like Scott Martis, for example? What was your goal with interviewing people?
That was at a time in my life where I was at a crossroads personally in my personal life. And I was kind of coming into myself as an adult. I believe I was 19 at the time, maybe 20, something around those lines. And I had a really weird experience. And I went on a show called Dogman Encounters with a really nice gentleman named Vic Cundiff. He was a very good friend of mine early on in the show, and it was actually him that kind of pushed me to start a podcast. He mentioned that he thought that I would be a good representative of the topic, and thought that I had an interesting point of view, and he said the more the merrier, why not try it out. And he was my first guest. I believe Scott Martis may have been the second or third, and it kind of went from there. I interviewed pretty much everyone from Monster Quest, Linda Godfrey, a ton of people. Jody Cook, pretty much everybody. It was went on for about 3 seasons. We did over 30 episodes.
Wow.
And ultimately, like I said, it just kind of, how many times can you ask the same question, really? But what I just was really fascinated with learning more about these things. When not just Dogman, but just cryptids in general. Like I think my first 2 episodes might have been Dogman related, and quickly after that, I was interviewing, ghost hunters, Scott Martis, alien abductees, UFO hunters, all kinds of people, just anything and everything anomalous at that point. I was just so fascinated, and I just wanted to know everything. And I guess you could say I was just like a naive kid, literally just for the first time really getting into a community and a niche and really like doing something outside of, my commonality interests, which at that time were pretty much just, chilling with my friends and playing some music here and there. So
Right. Do you have any particularly standout, or I guess maybe the word favorite could be used, people you had on the podcast, favorite experiences from doing the podcast?
Probably my favorite guest would probably, man, I almost said 3 different people's names there, honestly. I would probably say that the person I had the most fun talking with on the podcast and that was like most natural would probably be Vic Cundiff. He was always he's just a good conversation. He knows how to speak. Obviously, he's a host himself, so he knows how to convey things and keep the conversation going, especially back then when I wasn't very good at doing that. And I'd probably have to say my second one was a gentleman by the name of Kirk Stokes, who is a great cryptozoology YouTube channel and researcher. He goes out there and gets some really awesome and convincing footage, all kinds of weird things out there. I think his YouTube channel is called Kirk Stokes 19, I believe. It's something like that, and he has all kinds of crazy videos out there and just noises and sounds. It's insane. But talking to him and hearing his stories are just crazy. But there was a lot of awesome people. Bono Russell, was a cool guy to talk to. Scott Martis, of course, is a wealth of information. If you ask any sort of question about the water, he knows something about it. Same with pretty much any dinosaur as well. So
yeah,
very
definitely.
fun to talk to Scott.
Absolutely. As someone who's been in contact with him for a few different projects, everyone I talk to, including myself, always says he's a walking library for this kind of thing.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. What was it when you were still doing the podcast that you looked for in a person when you were looking for people to be on the podcast?
At first, it was kind of vague, so I didn't really know. I'd probably say like my first season was me just absolutely spitballing and throwing stuff at the wall. Pretty much every episode was after the interview was me pretty much being like, hey, so do you know anyone? That's pretty much how that happened. That's how I ran into pretty much, I went from Vic to a Dogman witness, and from there I went to a gentleman named Steve Carrington, and Steve was like, hey, I know a guy, and that's when I met Scott, and kind of so on and so forth. And when the second season came, after I, had a bit of a name and people kind of understood what the podcast was and all that, and it was, here to stay, and it wasn't just one of those, I guess what were people saying at the time is, Dogman Encounter rip-off shows or whatever. We were here to stay. I started actually like trying to find people who had a message, something that stood out. So the second season was like a lot of kind of more of the taboo, weird side stuff, like people talking about Sasquatch jumping through portals, and this guy saying that he has this. I spoke with a gentleman who had a connection with the Sasquatch people and would communicate with them with rolling stones back and forth, all kinds of crazy stuff. And I just wanted to make every season kind of not dive or devolve into weird stuff, but just kind of go to stories that you probably aren't going to hear anywhere else, and also try to make them informative if possible, because I think everybody's point of view is valid. Everybody's opinion is valid in this field, obviously, but at the same time, after you hear these kind of stories so many times, Bigfoot stealing somebody's trailer, Dogman doing a backflip over a Toyota Corolla, all kinds of crazy stuff. Eventually you're going to be like, I don't know, man, I kind of just want to go home. I don't want to do this anymore. Eventually you just hear things just like, man, it's like you want to believe, but then you're just like, you hear these crazy things. It's like, come on, man, you're telling me that you shot a 30 dog man from an Apache helicopter and nobody saw that? I don't know.
Is that one reason?
These are all things I actually heard, though. There was some pretty crazy stories. So there's sometimes where you just want to cut off the recording, but you can't. You're just like, oh man, that would be so rude. But there have been many times where I have been like, oh no, the audio was corrupted. And unfortunately, the show never aired. But that was just to honestly save the integrity of the show. But pretty much back to the point. It's just there's honestly, the podcast was a lot of fun. There was a lot of great moments, and the show just eventually did all it could do, you know?
With season 2 being defined by a lot of these kind of more outlandish feeling stories, what do you feel like season 3, the final season of the podcast, was defined by?
The final season kind of just mainly went back to what the first season was, but by the time the third season came, I had a much better idea of what I was doing. I understood how to talk to people and interview and have a conversation. And the third season was honestly much more like just like a talk show podcast. The last few episodes even had a co-host with me. So I had them on for a few shows, and it was kind of the same thing, but it was the two people having a conversation, and the last half hour we would have an interview, and if we didn't have an interview, we would share stories from people who sent in their stories who didn't want to be interviewed. And that's when the show began to, divulge into what it currently is now, with the main podcast, being the viewer-submitted stories, because I started enjoying that a lot more than, talking to people and having to go through the stress of interviews and making sure everybody's connected, the qualities, because most people I was talking to at that time, especially since Zoom wasn't around, and all these Discords weren't really around yet. It was just a pain to get good audio quality. So it just it was such a nice thing to only have to worry about my own quality from then on out.
Now, you mentioned this was kind of a gradual shift from being a more traditional podcast into being this sort of reading of the sent-in stories. Was that the case? Was that kind of a very gradual transition, or at some point did you decide, okay, we're going to stop doing interviews and we're going to start doing readings?
Excuse me. It was pretty much honestly, it was pretty much instantaneous. The last season I had I guess you could say it wasn't instantaneous, but it essentially was, because the last season I did have 2 episodes where it was just me reading stories. Like the Halloween special was me reading a really long, creature feature werewolf type thing. And there had been a few things that had happened like that, so it was kind of gradual. But for the initial, I guess you could say, hard reset was pretty quick. I left the podcast episodes up probably for a year or 2 after, but eventually, they were removed and all that. But yeah, it was pretty much instantaneous. I pretty much just punched it in and was like, if this works, it works. If it doesn't, feels bad, I guess I could always go back to that. If that's what I wanted to do. But at the time, I was just like, I really don't want to do that anymore. So I was like, all or nothing, throwing everything I got out there, all in. We'll see what happens, and it worked out.
Now, do you still do? Do you still do the readings, or are you shifting again towards a kind of different output of the genre now?
The channel is honestly so diverse, like I mentioned earlier, that I do everything still. I do absolutely everything but interviews at this point.
Right.
I interview people every so often, when it comes to the documentaries and stuff like that. But yeah, I still do the readings. It's pretty much the bulk of the content for sure. That's pretty much the daily content that comes out. Once or twice a month, I put out documentaries, usually a crime one. And the cryptid documentaries kind of come out in seasons because it's easier to work on them that way. Because I like to, when it comes to anything I'm doing, I like to make sure I put a lot of time into the script. I do pretty much everything myself on these projects. That's why it takes so long for me to get a lot of these out there. I do everything from research, script, interviews, video recording, audio recording, editing, everything you can imagine. I kind of do it all myself, and I have a few friends who help here and there, but pretty much it's just me doing everything I can condensed into this, as much little free time I have on the side. So it takes a lot to get them out, but they are definitely worth it in my opinion.
It sounds like you really enjoy doing a lot of that kind of the things you're involved in now. What?
Oh yeah.
At what point did you want to start really diversifying your content, not just by enriching it with the thing you enjoy doing, of course, which is partially the readings, but with more things that you found you really like doing?
Ultimately, it was just more of what more can I offer? What more can I do? What more can I, like how can I expand? How can I grow more? Like it ultimately kind of came down to that YouTuber aspect, I guess you could say, like how do I keep the channel growing? How do I keep the show going? And it also, I'm one of those people that's just, if I'm not creatively interested, it just dies. I can't do it. If it's like a job, I don't like to do it.
Right.
I don't want to do it. Obviously, like it's supposed to be. It starts off as a hobby. It's something you do for fun. It's something you love. I've always been a huge radio fan. I love the radio. So the narrations will probably be here for as long as I'm creating content. It's simply because I love podcasting. I love radio. I love sharing scary stories. I love voice acting. I love doing all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun, and it's a different side of my life, and it's a big part of the success of where I got. So to me, it's more of just you kind of continue to pay homage, and you can always still grow there. You can always be a better reader. You can always be a better narrator, a better voice actor. You can always be better. And I'm by no means the best, that is for sure. And diving into other stuff is just I think as anybody can kind of relate to is everybody's got more than one interest, right? I guess there might be that person out there that just likes one thing, but for me, I'm like I said earlier, a jack of all trades, a master of none. I love so much, and the creepy horror side of things is such a diverse, eclectic genre as it is. It can be true crime, it can be folklore, it can be cryptids, it could be absolutely anything, and that's why I think the channel is so diverse. Is there's so much cool stuff out there. Like I covered like historical, creepy history stuff like the Bloody Benders, which is like America's first serial killing family, and then you have the Kentucky Meat Shower, which is an event where like meat was raining from the sky. There's lots of cool times where like science and weird natural phenomena kind of meet the creepy horror fields as well. So there's endless stuff to do, and instead of making a million different channels like a lot of people do, I decided let's just make one place where everybody can come together and congregate. And every people that come for the scary, say, park ranger stories, they might see that I upload a documentary on, say, the Ningen, and they're like, oh, what's that? And they check it out, and boom, now we have new people in that cryptozoology world, and vice versa. So ultimately, I think it helps more than anything.
That sounds so interesting to kind of manage this flow of viewership in a way that's really optimal for the most of your viewers possible. What was your first idea to try and diversify things in that direction? What was your first branch off from doing the readings?
I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know I started off doing like the typical list style videos. So I had some vague videos. I think one or two of them are still up on the channel somewhere. But I remember I did one on vampire serial killers, which was weird. And then I did one on the scariest Native American creatures or whatever, stuff like that. And kind of started off that way because at the time I honestly just didn't know what else to do. And all top 15s was always on my timeline. So I was like, that looks like something I should probably do. And eventually, as I became, I guess, more of my own and started becoming more of my own personality and just more figuring what I wanted to get out of the content more. I think my first big project might have been a true crime one, but I believe my first big, crossover into the cryptid documentary world was when I did a short one on the wolves of Pavagata, and also in that same one I did a double feature with this weird phone. I believe it's the intro to Sasquatch Chronicles, the phone call somebody's allegedly seeing a Bigfoot or whatever.
Right.
And that was my first, I guess, dipping my toes into that crypto docu-series kind of thing, like, and it's kind of looking into mysteries, and from there it just kind of expanded and got better over time.
What's been your biggest project so far with all of the things you've been working on?
Documentary-wise, I do believe the most successful one. I'm trying to debate what I want to call the documentary, because I do have a few. I have a series of state park. I guess that counts. I have a series of state park disappearances. I guess you call them missing 411 disappearances that I covered a couple years ago, and they just exploded for some reason. Nearly 1 million views on multiple of them.
Wow.
And I'd probably say that's probably the most successful one, but like I hardly count those as like documentaries, because like there was like hardly any editing. It was more of like an audio based thing. But actual documentary, like a lot of editing, film, stuff like that, would probably be the Skinwalker Ranch feature I did.
What was it like making that? Because Skinwalker Ranch is a really kind of, in a weird way, everyone has heard the name Skinwalker Ranch, but I feel like to most people it is a kind of obscure subject.
Yeah, it's a very vague one too. I didn't really know much about it. I've heard a lot about it, and Skinwalkers on my channel are one of the number one things that people love. People are all about that boogeyman, and so I decided to look into it. I bought a bunch of books on it. I dove into it. I even visited as much as I could, obviously. And ultimately, I was surprised to learn that everything from UFOs to ghosts to black-eyed children to skinwalkers to dogmen to whatever else you could possibly imagine apparently happens on this property. And it's just the stories that come out from this place are absolutely fascinating. And I don't know, if there is any place to have an eclectic group of supernatural and government experiments, this would be the place, I guess.
Now, where is Skinwalker Ranch? Is that, I keep forgetting, is that in Arizona or?
It's in Utah.
Utah. Okay, right. And is it a community, or is it like a single piece of like private property, or?
It's a pretty big piece of property located in like this little small like desert mountain town. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I know it's in the Winta area.
Okay.
I just can't think of the name of the actual town at the very moment.
So was there anything in particular, aside from just the wide variety of reports from the area, were there any stories in particular that you found that made you think, I've got to do a documentary on this?
Oh yes, one I featured pretty heavily in this one is the story of the father, his son, and I believe one other person from the family, maybe even the mom, are out trying to free a calf that got his head stuck, and this giant black wolf comes from the distance and tries to get it, and like they shoot it so many times, and it's not dying, and it eventually runs away, and I believe it takes the calf with it, but if I'm not mistaken. But that was the story. I was like, what the hell? That is absolutely insane. This guy's coming out here with a 30-06, spraying this thing, and the thing ain't dying. And then he takes out a handgun, and I believe it was a 45 revolver, and starts loading in this thing's face, and this thing is just laughing at it pretty much. So that was when I was like, that's interesting. And then I learned about all the other weird things, like the people who sold it to the Sherman family, I believe, because it's also called Sherman Ranch. They're like, you can't dig on the property. If you dig on the property, something. So I was like, there's just like so many weird things. So I was like, man, this could either turn out to be some crazy true crime thing with a bunch of bodies in this land, or this could turn out to be like the real life poltergeist.
Do you feel yourself that you have any particular leanings with what might be happening at Skinwalker Ranch?
Personally, there's so many different diverse stories with so many different types of things going on. But ultimately, I would say it's probably just a place of high energy. There's probably some sort of portal thing going on there. I don't really know. I don't really get too crazy into the whole portals or dimensions or energy, whatever people want to call it. But I do believe in energy, and I believe that there are places in the world that just have high amounts of energy, and weird things happen because of it. And I'm not exactly sure, but I do believe there could be something there. If even, say, 10% of the stories that I found are true, I would still be of that mindset.
Considering the kind of such a strange nature for a case, what was it like making the Skinwalker Ranch documentary you made?
Honestly, at that point, I had already been pretty desensitized to skinwalkers and all that. So, like, the nature of maybe being cursed or hunted down by some sort of Navajo mercenary didn't really scare me too much more than all the other weird aspects of what was going on, maybe being abducted by some aliens or falling into holes, because apparently there's a lot of explosions out there. And I was like, well, that sucks. Maybe I'm going to get, like, blown up or something. But we didn't really get on the property too much. We more just kind of filmed around it and stuff like that. So it worked out in that sense. But I'd probably say, I don't know, like, just like that feeling of being around an area that this is just so infamous. So many people are always talking about this online. I've had many friends be like, oh yeah, I live by that. I've seen creepy stuff there, and just you know, being in this area, it just felt like electric. It was like, wow, this is, you know, you're just waiting for something to pop off. You kind of want something too, but ultimately it's just a very quiet and, you know, utterly boring area.
Now, do you work with a film crew, or are you kind of a one-man team?
I just work with personal friends. Sometimes I will hire extra people if needed. Sometimes, you know, if I need like a professional or somebody who, you know, has more skill in an area that I can't quite do something in, or if I need, you know, somebody for safety reasons or whatever, I'll hire people of that nature. I'm trying to make the documentaries more, I guess you could say, mainstream-like, in the sense of, like, I'm trying to bring in interviews with people again, like on camera, and do a little bit more visual production. So we're kind of investing more into, you know, all these crazy GoPros and, you know, microphones and underwater cameras and all the lights, trying to just do more to make it a more fulfilling experience for the viewer. So that's kind of like my biggest thing for 2021, and that's where the thing with Scott Martis comes into play, where we've talked about a lot of things over the years, and I've known Scott at this point like 5 or 6 years, and we've haven't done anything since the podcast, and I was like, you know, we might as well, you know, see what we can get done. And Scott probably has information on this stuff, because I had a good amount. I had like a wealth of information on what we were looking at, but Scott came in and just smashed everything I had, and came in with a encyclopedia of all kinds of stuff, and just like, yeah, here's all this stuff. I didn't know any of that existed. All right. And and I'm just trying to, you know, keep step by step making the show better. Never stop growing, never stop grinding, that's for sure. You know, once you become complacent or, you know, content with what you're doing, I believe that's when your content starts to die.
Right, absolutely. What was it that made you want to do a documentary on Florida lake monsters specifically?
I've been on a big southern kick the past year. I'm a southern boy. I've lived all over the South. I'm very proud of that. I'm one of the weird people, though. I don't really have a southern accent. It's slightly there here and there as I get older. But my whole family talks like this, you know, being from Kentucky and Tennessee and you know, rural Florida. They all have very thick accents. So I've always been kind of an outcast and all that kind of stuff. But I've always had strong southern pride and love the area I come from, because there's a lot of awesome history and a lot of interesting folklore, and especially when it comes to the Native American aspect, there's so much to love here down in the South outside of, you know, just the Civil War. So I just have a lot of pride and love for that, and I've been doing a series for true crime stuff where I've been going through the southern United States and doing a couple of cold cases that don't have much detail to them or are very lesser known to the public, and you know, covering them in the video and trying to put together cohesive stories for them to help, you know, further those outside of them just having like a Charlie Project page. Because even though those websites are helpful, they're very vague, and a lot of people can't really get the story or understand the story from just seeing a web page full of text. So I like to try to take that and a bunch of like articles and just anything I can find and try to compile it all together and make a very good cohesive story that makes sense. That's of course in my own words, and that is a little bit more human to the touch than just female missing, blue hair, blonde eyes, blah blah blah.
Right.
Blue hair, blonde eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes. But it's just, I don't know. There's just something about being local to Florida, and everybody just like you always have the stereotypes. It's always skunk ape, or it's alligators, or it's big snakes and stuff like that. I was like, but what about all these lakes we have here? What about all these canals? What about all these insane stories of monsters that even have allegedly killed people, like in the case that we're going to be covering? So there's a lot of interesting stuff, and in this particular case, there's the St. Johns River, and there's been stories from the bottom of that river to the top of that river of monsters of all sorts, and they ultimately all kind of sound the same. And then you go just a few more miles off the coast of Florida up into another river called the Altamaha, and there's stories of things that are very similar to what people are talking about at St. John. So I was like, well, why not kind of cover 3 different locations in between the bottom and the top of these areas and see what we can find.
Did anything prompt you to look at the St. John's River monster in specific?
It's just the easiest one, personally. But I actually didn't cover it. Actually, I'm not even actually really looking at the St. John's monster in this one. There's another documentary I'm doing more particular on St. John's monster.
Okay.
But this one, I actually just found some, like, I was going for obscure, weird stuff. And personally, I've heard of a lot of monsters in Florida, but not much of water monsters, surprisingly. And that's where I found, Lake Monroe monster, the Lake Clinch monster, and then ultimately we're covering the Altamaha monster, the Alti case as well.
What have you found in your research of southern and specifically Floridian lake monsters?
I have found that a lot of them seem to either be big snakes, big turtles, or potentially alligators, or maybe sturgeon. But I do believe that back in the day, there could have been a lot more going on than there is now. Obviously, with how the environment's been going over the last, 100 years or so, and how fishing and all that has gone, and development. But something that me and Scott touch on heavily in this is, I find it very hard to believe that people who live in an area all their life, they see alligators, manatees, etc. on a daily basis, would suddenly mistake these things, and suddenly be scared, and suddenly not understand what's happening or what they're seeing. So ultimately, that's why I continue to cover and look into them, because even though most of these things could be chalked up to basic things such as sturgeon or turtles or snakes even, I do think that there, like I said earlier, there's a grain of truth in everything. And, as a Floridian myself, I could not see myself seeing a manatee swim by and me being like, oh, wow, man, that's a sea monster, man.
For this documentary, is there a particular kind of theme that's being gone with? Like, maybe is it very eyewitness interview based? Is it very boots on the ground investigation based?
It's kind of my spearhead into changing the docuseries into more of that archival style I was talking about earlier, into a more practical, typical, viewer, or I guess eyewitness interview based stuff, but also boots on the ground with a bit of that archive style as well. This one's kind of like a precursor into the St. John's documentary, as I mentioned, and this one is kind of like a mix of that archive style, also adding in that eyewitness and researcher interview aspect as well.
That sounds so interesting. Are there any eyewitness reports that you've read or been able to talk to people about that stand out to you in particular?
Yes, I've talked to a few locals for the Lake Clinch story. But the one in particular I'll tell you about that's very interesting is from the Altamaha. Apparently, there's a lady who saw this thing, cresting its head or crowning its head, I should say, out of the water and then going right back down. And she got a video of it. Now you can find it on YouTube. I'll have to send it to you after this. And to me, it almost looks like some sort of shark or something. But to her, in person, she said it was definitely not a shark. So that's probably one that stands out to me as much, just because there is some sort of video to it. Whether or not it's a monster or something else, stuff like that stands out to me as more memorable, I guess, off the top of my head, because there's something visual to go with the story and the claim.
Right. Is there any form of evidence in particular that you find exceedingly compelling?
In this documentary in particular, not particularly. I haven't seen anything that's really made me be like, yeah, there's definitely a monster here. But it kind of goes with my same opinion on like Nessie and all that. I believe that like maybe at one time, for sure, these things were around. For sure, there was some sort of monster here, but I'm not going in. I'm not really in this with the mind of like we're gonna find a monster. But I do think that at one point it is very possible that there was something lurking in the water that we might not be used to seeing.
When can people expect to see the documentary up on your channel?
I'm hoping to have it out by early March. But since I am in talks with a bunch of different providers right now, because we're trying to expand and get a little bit more backing to make things happen a bit easier, because I want to definitely expand and leave the South, obviously. The South is just more accessible to me right now since I live here and it's easier to get to than having to fly a bunch of people across the country or to other countries at the moment on my own dime. But probably early March, that's what we're shooting for. We're pretty close to finishing filming. We just need to film a few interviews for the Monroe area and pretty much just have to film our little investigation for the Altamaha. We are ready to get this bad boy out there.
Well, that sounds absolutely incredible. Is there any other details that can be given right now, or is it kind of under wraps a bit until it comes out?
It'll probably be about 30-something minutes long. It'll be covering 3 different stories that all potentially intertwine and kind of a spearhead into the greater St. John River monster story, which is going to be a much longer and tedious project. I guess all I can really add outside of that without giving away too much information is I don't know, honestly. I guess that's about it. It'll be a lot of fun. Scott Martis is in it. There's a few other cool cryptozoology researchers that have sent in information and helped us out a lot. We've gotten to go to a lot of cool places like Dinosaur World. We've gotten to see a lot of really cool places that have like manatees and alligators in captivity, even wild alligators and stuff. So we've been able to get cool footage of a lot of state parks we've gone to. I'm a state park guy myself anyway. I go to these places as much as possible. Big partner and big fan of the Forestry Service, even worked as a park ranger for quite some time. So I very much love, anytime I can get out there and do something natural or out in the trees, if you will. I think that's all I can really share at this point. I don't know if there's much more I can give away on the front that isn't more of just like back end stuff.
Right. Kind of bringing it full circle, considering the goals that you have with presenting this kind of information and the kind of scientific viewpoint you take with it. What is your favorite part about making a documentary like this?
I'd probably say the research and scripting. I really love looking and stuff. I love writing. I used to hate it as a kid. I had a bad speech impediment, and I still have it, but it's definitely much more manageable since, for 4 years now, my job has pretty much just been to speak out loud. So pretty much has helped me overcome a lot of the stutters and stammers and such.
Right.
Obviously you're always going to have your struggles with that, but I'd say that's probably my favorite part is just the beginning steps of finding something, looking into it, learning about it, writing about it, and sometimes, depending on my mood, I even enjoy editing it together every so often. But I'd probably say my least favorite is honestly just going out into the field. It's just tiring. It's long. It's a lot harder than I think a lot of people give it credit for. A lot of long drives, and I'm a tall guy, so driving is very tiring. I'm all cramped up in cars, and it's just it's a lot of anxiety too when you're out there in the middle of nowhere on these woods. We've done a lot of crazy things. I guess a quick story I could tell you is we were doing a documentary on the skunk ape, and we rented these small little one-person kayaks. It's just me and my friends. We have headlights and GoPros attached to us, and we're just slowly floating down this river. We don't have our headlights on at the moment because we wanted to turn it off and try out our night vision and see how it would look and get some good footage that way. When I look back at this footage, it is honestly the most terrifying footage I've ever seen in my life. But at the moment, I was completely oblivious. There's some pitch black in the middle of this river. It feels like I'm hitting bumps. So I'm saying, man, this must be a shallow river. There must be a lot of debris in the water. I don't know what the heck's happening. And then I hear like a little bit of splash off in the distance. I'm like, oh, hell no, I need to see what that is. So I turn my light on, and as my headlight goes on, I see what looks like a million little red dots on the top of the water. And that's when it quickly dawns upon me that I'm literally swimming in the middle of a bunch of alligators.
Oh my God.
I'm literally surrounded by alligators in this kayak right now.
Wow.
And for whatever reason, they did not give a flying rat's tooth about me because I slowly just kept paddling, and we just made it out somehow. But those are the kind of things that I don't really enjoy doing when I'm just trying to float down a river and get some shots of the water. Quite literally just some B-roll. Almost getting eaten by a million alligators. But interesting stuff goes into it, but it's a lot of fun overall. I really enjoy getting to learn about this because there's just so much to learn, and I learned so much about culture and heritage and just learning how to pronounce new words, and especially with all the Native American names out there, it's very informative, and I think it's very valuable to know a lot of this stuff.
Well, it sounds like it's a really, really great documentary if that's the kind of mindset that you have going into it, and I'm sure a lot of us can't wait to see it.
I hope people enjoy it. It's gonna be fun for sure. It's gonna be interesting. Got a lot of cool stuff coming. So
it sounds like it. Do you have any plans for documentaries after this one?
Aside from the St. John River one I told you about, I do have tons of plans. I have a historical docuseries type of thing coming out on a beast called the Washuge, which is from the Athabascan people up in Canada, or Canada, as most people would probably call it. And I think it's very interesting. It's similar to like a Wendigo type of thing.
Right.
And I like doing those ones because you can kind of connect. The Wendigos from people who are about 1,000 miles away on the other side of Canada. And they're essentially kind of like very similar stories, like different backstories, but kind of the ultimate same outcome with, the same fear. And, it's just cool to see how different cultures connect and how these people who have never met or spoke to each other have similar fears. And if you look at pretty much any group of Native American people, they always have a set of boogeymen, whether it's their own Bigfoot, their own werewolf, their own skinwalker, if you will. They all have one, and they all kind of represent the same thing at the end of the day. So
right.
I think it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Well, I'd love to thank you for being on, Robbie. This has been a really fantastic talk, and you're such a very self-examining person that always makes a really great conversation.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be on, and thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Of course.
Hopefully, I could answer these questions somewhat well. I'm not, as I said, I'm not like a cryptozoologist or an expert on anything, but if I can, talk about myself, I guess I'll be okay.
Mm. Well, it was a really great conversation. Again, thank you so much, Robbie.
Yeah, definitely.